Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Here we are, the 2023 Festival of Monsters, the middle of day two, or the end of day two, getting close to the end of day two. Thank you so much for being here. It's been such a pleasure for me to be able to interact with everybody and to learn so much about what you are all bringing as scholars of monstrosity to our little community here. And it's just been a blast to get to know all of you and to learn more about your work. It's my very, very great honor and pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker. Jess Zimmerman is an editor at Quirk Books and a freelance writer of essays, fiction, and prose poetry. She was previously the editor-in-chief of Electric Literature, right? The founding editor of Archipelago, and a contributing editor for The Establishment. And the reason why she's here is because she is the author of a book called Women and Other Monsters, which, when I read it, blew my mind. And I'm not even a woman. I don't know if that was, in case anyone was curious. So when I read this book, I thought we have got to get Jess Zimmerman to come to the Festival of Monsters. I was so excited. I was really fanboying, you know, like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. But I wrote to her agent, and we got a really generous and courteous response, and things developed from there, and it has just been a real pleasure to work with Jess up until this point. So a big Santa Cruz Festival of Monsters welcome to Jess Zimmerman.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Michael, so much. I feel very privileged to be here and to have been able to see some of the talks and the panels so far, which I'm going to be thinking about for a long time. I'm going to start with a little bit of a reading from my book, Women and Other Monsters, and then I'll sort of like expand on that a little bit. I'm not going to, there's a whole author's note to this effect, and I'm not going to like read the whole thing, but I do want to be clear from the jump what I mean when I say women. I am talking about the identity category, which is what we usually mean when we say women, people who understand themselves as women and or live publicly as women. More than that, I'm talking about the social category, which is to say everyone who has at some time or another been on the wrong end of patriarchal misogyny. So this is likely at some time or another going to include trans men, non-binary and genderqueer people assigned female at birth, femme-presenting people of all genders. It may even include at times cis men who have been victimized for not seeming manly enough. It's a big tent. Some of us get thrown in there whether we want to be there or not. It's a little annoying that this means that I wind up using the word women in a way that includes people who are definitely not women in terms of the identity category, but so does society, which is kind of the point. And it's also not nearly as annoying as if I had to say that whole thing every time I use the word. All right. The first thing you saw when entering the Dangerous Beauty exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art was a vintage dress from Versace's 1992 to 1993 Miss S&M collection. Straps of quilted leather crisscrossed the throat and décolletage of a mannequin, each strap adorned with a dollar-sized brassy coin bearing the head of a howling gorgon. The overall effect was oddly militaristic, a sort of four-star dominatrix look. The exhibit, subtitled Medusa in Classical Art, was tiny, tucked away in a single room in the mezzanine of the Greek and Roman art collection next to the study gallery. So perhaps the dress was there to grab the attention of tourists who might have wandered up from the floor below. This is often the purpose, after all, of women's bodies and the clothing that adorns them, especially clothing that highlights the body's constraints. They are there to catch the eye. In this case, though, gawkers lured in by Miss S&M were deposited into a room full of artifacts depicting not only Medusa, but a coven of other female creatures of antiquity. Gorgon faces, both horrible ancient ones with tusks and beards, and later ones whose placid classical symmetry is broken only by a few demure snakes at the temples, stared out from roof tiles, armor, cups, and cameos. A piece of pottery showed Scylla with her snake legs splayed, a pack of dog heads lunging from her crotch. Sirens perched their bird bodies on plates and mirrors. On one side of a shallow goblet, a sphinx was painted in loving miniature, crouching over a male victim who appeared to plead for his life. Chasing after the female torso in her chic bondage, in other words, landed you in a nest of monsters. The 60 pieces in the exhibit were intended to track the way Medusa and her counterparts became subject, despite their monstrousness, to principles of beauty. A gold pendant with a Gorgon's face from 450 BCE showed a grimacing creature with sharp teeth, a protruding tongue, a creased brow, a knobbly chin. An exquisite 19th century cameo displayed in the same case showed a perfect, precise neoclassical profile, which is to say she looked a bit like Graham Chapman, but that was the style at the time. Apart from a coil of snake at the crown of her head, like a fascinator, and another knotted scarf-like beneath her chin, she had no visible markers of monstrousness. Creatures conceived as repulsive were gradually reimagined as appealing, even seductive, at least on their faces. The monstrosity remains, but it's no longer visible. In a society centered on the male citizen, the feminization of monsters served to demonize women, writes curator Kiri Karaglou in an accompanying bulletin. The later monsters don't just look more beautiful and more feminine, they look more human, underscoring the idea that monstrousness is somehow the human woman's natural condition. As monsters become more pleasing to the eye, they were defanged, beauty being equated in classical Greece with moral goodness, and paradoxically made more dangerous. A Medusa with tusks, whiskers, and a grotesque distended tongue could easily be pegged as a threat. A human-looking Medusa could fly under the radar until you tried to brush her hair. The resulting girl-face beasts, read the exhibition text, foreshadow, this is a quote, the conceit of the seductive but threatening female that emerges in the late 19th century in reaction to women's empowerment, end quote. When a feminine face might belong to a secret Gorgon, any woman could be a monster. Perhaps every woman was. This is one of the legacies we've inherited from the classical era, which underpins so much of what Westerners see as culture and civilization. A suspicion of women in general, a feeling that every one of them may have claws and tails if you look below the waterline. The monsters massed together in this little room at the Met represented a series of cautionary tales. Women may look harmless in the face, they said, but look at their snake hair and dog crotches and claws. Look at them crouched over a male victim, ready to bite. Beware their ambition, their ugliness, their insatiable hunger, their ferocious rage. It was these cautionary tales that brought me to the Met, shortly before the exhibit closed in January 2019. I was writing about these female monsters and a few others from the same period, specifically how they're used to represent qualities that women are supposed to tone down, lest we be seen as dangerous or grotesque. I wanted to look them in the face, all these sphinxes and gorgons. I wanted to be surrounded by them and to see if there was a place among them for me. Because my project was to rehabilitate these monsters. Not externally, like the male artists who gradually made their forms more pleasing and symmetrical, but by showing how the traits that we were told made them dangerous are actually their greatest strengths, and ours. All the stories about monstrous women, about creatures who are too gross, too angry, too devious, too grasping, too smart for their own good, are stories told by men. I came to the Met to wonder what the stories the monsters themselves would tell. What would Medusa say about the ugliness she first experienced as an unjust punishment and then learned to use as a weapon? What happens when we free the Sphinx from the drama of Oedipus and let her exist as something more than an obstacle to a man? What was it like for the sirens on their lonely rock, watching everyone who tried to love them drown? There were a few reasons I was interested in these particular monsters, the ones in the Met exhibit and their sisters in antiquity. The first is just that I dig them. I was raised on D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths. My childhood copy, which my parents still have, is missing both covers and parts of the index, and boasts several more full-color illustrations than other copies, because I went to town on it with a marker when I was 4. Point of order, I think it's at this point common knowledge that trade books don't get fact-checked. I said 4 in the book because I thought I remembered doing this, and then when I went back to the original document, like, there's no way I had that kind of hand-eye coordination. So we regret the error. The second reason, which is related, is that other people dig them too. Almost every day while working on this book, I thought about this now deleted tweet. Okay, horse girls definitely had an energy, but let's talk about the real powerhouses of middle school weird girls, the ancient mythology stands. At the time of deletion, it had over 70,000 likes. The mythology stands are a powerful demographic. And right now, at least, it seems we find the monsters and villains particularly resonant. For an example, take Luciano Garbati's sculpture of Medusa with the severed head of Perseus, who, despite her swimsuit model proportions and curiously blank pubis, became a popular feminist symbol in 2018, splashed across social media feeds to declare that women were fighting back. The actual statue was eventually installed opposite the Manhattan courthouse where Harvey Weinstein was tried. Also in 2018, Madeline Miller's Circe, a basically perfect novel that rehabilitates the enchantress who turns the hero's men into pigs in the Odyssey, was a major phenomenon and a huge bestseller. Circe was not the first story of Greek antiquity to be revisited with the intent of putting sidelined or maligned women at the center. From the vantage point of 2023, it definitely also wasn't the last. More on that later. But we were hungry for stories like Circe, which shook a villainess free from the minds of men and gave her a voice of her own. The mythology stands were out for blood. Finally, I focused on these monsters because classical antiquity is called classical for a reason. It's a name bestowed by people who thought that all the best, highest class ideas, aesthetics, and ethics came from the 5 or 6 centuries on either side of 0 CE. The images and myths of antiquity influenced the art we still elevate, the literature that's disproportionately taught in schools, even our language. Many of the monsters I wrote about have snaked their way into the general vocabulary, metaphorically referring to a certain type of person or problem, rather than the creature itself. When a woman is called a harpy or a gorgon, or less disparagingly, a screen siren, when you're caught between Scylla and Charybdis, when a problem that worsens the more you try to fix it is a hydra, when an unsolvable question is the riddle of the Sphinx, that is evidence of the outsized influence of classical lore. The monsters in this book are part of the mythos that influenced the current dominant culture as it was being built. These are the bedtime stories patriarchy tells itself. Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, the humanities professor who literally wrote the book on monster theory, outlined 7 defining characteristics of the monster. I know these won't be new to a lot of you guys, but they were new to, I think, most people reading the book. Some are pretty academic, but a few were immediately resonant. The monster dwells at the gates of difference, and the monster polices the borders of the possible. Monsters are signposts, in other words, to separate acceptable from unacceptable, what's allowed from what is not. Their monstrosity is deviation blown up to exaggerated size, the mythic equivalent of, if you keep making that face, your face will stick that way. Monsters exist in opposition to normality, exaggeratedly large or small, too many limbs or too few eyes, too complex or too rudimentary. Monstrosity is relative, born in the gulf between the expectation and the reality. Even Godzilla could live happily in a Godzilla-scale Tokyo. But if the expectations are too narrow, nearly anything can become monstrous. If you are only allowed to be tiny, it is grotesque to be medium. If you are only allowed to be quiet, it is freakish to be loud. The more you are circumscribed, the easier it is to deviate, and the more deviation comes to seem outlandish or even dangerous. For women, the boundaries of acceptability are strict, and they are many. We must be seductive but pure, quiet but not aloof, fragile but industrious, and always, always small. We must not be too successful, too ambitious, too independent, too self-centered. And when we can't manage all the contradictory restrictions, we are turned into grotesques. Women have been monsters, and monsters have been women, in centuries' worth of stories, because stories are a way to encode and pass on these expectations. We've built a culture on the backs of these monstrous women, letting them prop up tired morals about safety and normalcy and feminine propriety. But the traits they represent, aspiration, knowledge, strength, desire, are not hideous. In men's hands, they have always been heroic. The monsters of myth have been stationed at these borders in order to keep us out. They are intended as warnings about what happens when women aspire beyond what they're allowed. The she-beasts in this book, and the illustrations are from the book, by the way, but I didn't do them. I wish. The she-beasts in this book patrol the borders of ambition, intellect, complexity, power, pride. They mark areas on a map. Do not enter. Here be monsters. But if stepping outside the boundaries makes you monstrous, that means monsters are no longer bound. What happens if we charge through the gates and find that living on the other side, in all our too muchness, oversized and overweening and overcomplicated as we are, means living fully for the first time. Then the monster story stops being a warning sign and starts to be a guide. Draw a new map, mark down, be monsters here. So, now by way of transition, I want to read you another more recent text that feels like it's in conversation with the intro that I just read, and also with the book as a whole. It is literally impossible to be a woman. You are so beautiful and so smart, and it kills me that you don't think you're good enough. Like, we always have to be extraordinary, but somehow we're always doing it wrong. You have to be thin, but not too thin, and you can never say you want to be thin. You have to say you want to be healthy, but also you have to be thin. You have to have money, but you can't ask for money because that's crass. You have to be a boss, but you can't be mean. You have to lead, but you can't squash other people's ideas. You're supposed to love being a mother, but don't talk about your kids all the damn time. You have to be a career woman, but also always be looking out for other people. You have to answer for men's bad behavior, which is insane. But if you point that out, you're accused of complaining. You're supposed to stay pretty for men, but not so pretty that you tempt them too much, or that you threaten other women, because you're supposed to be part of the sisterhood. But always stand out and always be grateful, but never forget that the system is rigged. So find a way to acknowledge that, but also always be grateful. You have to never get old, never be rude, never show off, never be selfish, never fall down, never fail, never show fear, never get out of line. It's too hard. It's too contradictory, and nobody gives you a medal or says thank you. And it turns out that not only are you doing everything wrong, but also everything is your fault. That is, of course, America Ferrera's monologue from the recent blockbuster movie Barbie. I think a couple of people twigged. For those of you who haven't seen the film, this is a pivotal moment in terms of both plot and thesis. Mild spoiler alert, by giving voice to the overlapping and often contradictory restrictions on women's life choices and self-expression, Ferrera's character Gloria is able to snap the Barbies out of their almost hypnotic subservience to the new Ken-led patriarchy and mobilize them to thwart total Ken supremacy. About a week before I saw the movie, the Nashville Public Library did an Instagram post where they put my book on a list of books on Barbie's to read list. And at the time I was like, that's funny and weird, but then I watched the movie and I was like, oh, how do I get that bitch a copy? Now, does this mean Barbie is a monster movie? Well, consider the evidence. Like Godzilla, Barbie troubles our sense of scale. Like Annabelle and Chucky, she troubles our understanding of the boundary between the living and the inanimate. A trip to Barbie Land is a trip into the uncanny valley. The Barbie movie even has its own Baba Yaga figure, a prophetic crone relegated to the outskirts of Barbie civilization. Now, my intention here is not actually to present a detailed treatise on Barbie as movie monster, although if someone wants to do that at next year's conference, you can have that idea for free. I'm just kidding, it costs $1. But the reason I bring it up is that this is the biggest film of 2023, I think biggest, most popular live action comedy ever of all time. And it's a movie that is consumed with highlighting and traversing the borders of the possible. And I don't just mean the in-universe borders between the real and unreal worlds, although Barbie crisscrosses those multiple times over the course of the film. But the myriad limits that real-life women and feminized people run up against in a world controlled by patriarchy. Both these types of borders and limitations are crucial to the plot of the film. And Barbie herself, the dweller at the gates of difference, first reinforces and then ultimately explodes those boundaries. And it's the explosion that I want to talk about. As I think all of us who are thinking deeply about monsters right now have noticed, we are the fortunate witnesses to a cultural shift where the monster moves from cautionary tale to role model. Barbie is a monster movie because it's a movie about a marginalized group recognizing and then escaping the constraints that have bound them under the previous status quo. Increasingly, even our most mainstream stories are monster stories in this specific way. They refuse to normalize those constraints and, in fact, valorize breaking through them. The creatures that thunder past the borders of the possible, once figures of fear, are increasingly figures of admiration. This is an exciting cultural time to be studying monsters, maybe the most exciting time, because it's a time when the distinction between the monster and the hero blurs. Increasingly, we love monsters, we embrace monsters, because of the way they eliminate previously invisible or obfuscated strictures. By invisible, I mean that these constraints were supposed to be ignored or treated as natural and unassailable, and by and large were ignored by mainstream cultural artifacts, in order to soothe the people who've placed themselves at the center. It can make you a little bonkers to be hemmed in by these invisible fences, marking off areas in which people outside the cis white male default should fear to tread. But if there's a monster stationed at the gate, that means the fence was really there all along. And if there's a gatekeeper, that means there's a gate to walk out, and that there's something beyond. Sure, the space beyond is the province of monsters, but if freedom is monstrous, then maybe that's where we want to be. The dweller at the gate becomes a signpost of the way out. I mentioned earlier the legacy of Circe, which I think is a great example of this shift. I work in publishing in my day job, so for me, it's the book trends that really make me sit up and take notice. And Circe heralded an absolute frenzy of feminist retellings of either ancient Greek myths or classic female villains or both. So that whole right-hand circle is evil women of various types, from mythology or folklore or other parts of culture. Monsters who have been swept up and embraced by this trend include Medusa and her Gorgon sisters, Grendel's mother, Baba Yaga, demon mother Lilith. There are also metaphorical monsters, like the sorceresses Medea and Morgan Le Fay, murderous Queen Clytemnestra, and problematic haberdasher Cruella de Vil. Each of these books, and I threw in one movie, reevaluates and generally rehabilitates one of these monstrous women by delving into her perspective and experience rather than positioning her as a threat or an obstacle. I don't think we can give Madeline Miller sole credit for this. There's an idea whose time has come element. She definitely made these ideas look marketable. And in a capitalist context, that may be the greatest evidence of a real shift in the locus of cultural power. I think this is true also of Barbie. This trend didn't originate the recentering of the excluded figure, but it did help make that move mainstream. Now, these are all, I think without exception, books by cis white women. This particular trend is very specifically the trend of revisiting the stories of white-coated female monsters and villains, and Barbies. But this is part of the reason that we're at an exciting inflection point. These are the stories that are currently rushing to the center of the culture, becoming the blockbuster movies and the best-selling novels, because of course that's going to be easiest for the people who are closest in the center already. But we are also on the rising edge of a new tide of incredible stories, interrogating and reinscribing the monstrosity of monsters and villains from a range of cultures and a range of lived experiences. These are just a few examples that I like. Where the Wild Ladies Are by Aoko Matsuda retells Japanese folktales about female ghosts. The Night Parade by Jamie Lynn Nakamura, not out yet, but you should get it when it is. It's a forthcoming speculative memoir that uses East Asian monsters to explore mental illness. The Haunting of Alejandra by V. Castro is about a woman cursed by the Mexican monster La Llorona. And of course, there's the Dear Lady from a variety of American indigenous cultures. She appears in one form in The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones, but I'm particularly fond of her incarnation in Reservation Dogs. We are poised for a wild rumpus of monsters coming in from the margins. And this is something that I didn't write down because I was thinking about it mostly after the really incredible Black Nerds Create panel yesterday. But another thing that's interesting about these monsters is that the project here is more interesting and more nuanced than rehabilitation. These are centering the monsters, but not necessarily sort of taming them or making them acceptable or locating them within conventional morality. They're the heroes because they're the most important. They're not necessarily the heroes because they are made admirable or because they're defanged in any way. The very word marginalized is predicated on this idea of boundaries, of a group of people who are swept towards the edges of a cultural space and a center that is supposed to be accepted uncritically and never interrogated. But by refocusing on these boundary figures, the monster story is able to essentially reverse the center and the margins. This is why, in addition to revisiting old stories to recontextualize the villainy of the monstrous characters, we've also been getting some really wonderful works that show white supremacy, patriarchy, gentrification, and other elements of the dominant culture as monstrous characters, as the monstrous figures they've really been all along. This is Ring Shout by P. Jelly Clark, which is a novella set in 1920s Georgia in which the KKK is made up of literal monsters. The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, cosmic horror novel in which the infiltrating elder god figure is a metaphor for gentrification and whitewashing of the city. Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt, a haunted house novel where the house is both a monster in itself and a metaphor for encroaching fascism. And the comics panel yesterday made me realize that I really should have included Boys Weekend by Maddie Lebchansky, which is a graphic novel in which the monster kind of stands in for kind of bro culture, but also cis-normativity, a whole bunch of stuff. Of course, etymologically, monster means portent or warning, and we have always needed more warnings about those who place themselves in the center than about those who are swept to the side. And I think that this is, I think this is the natural next stage of monster domination, a sort of pole reversal where the current center becomes more visibly monstrous as we embrace the margins. This reversal means recognizing the harm that has been done through marginalization and constraints on certain groups. That's putting the monsters at the center. And then it also means recognizing the harm that has come from treating other groups as the default model of humanity, against whom others become monstrous in comparison. That's turning the previously unquestioned dominant structures into figures of fear. Now, dismantling the borders and the center and the mechanism by which both are enforced essentially puts us into uncharted territory, sort of a featureless plane. That's scary stuff, although I think everyone here will agree that the scary stuff is the best stuff. We may even have to pass through a period in which monstrosity and normality are both vertiginously undefined, since they exist fundamentally in relation to each other. But what this deconstruction then opens up is a whole universe of structures that are more potentially interesting than center here, boundary there, and then out here is monsters. I'm gonna get quite literally abstract here because I felt all of my old academic hand-wavy instincts bubble up as I was thinking about this, but bear with me. What if instead of that circle or whatever flat shape you want, we had a torus, a bubble cluster, a Klein bottle, one of these guys? I don't know the answer to this at all, mind you. I barely know what the question means. But it's this type of question that makes me excited to keep following our current reinscription of the monster. I think the time is ripe for our monstrous and mythological rehabilitations to get bigger, more ambitious, and more challenging to the status quo. As we continue moving into this new monster era, I hope we see an ever-broadening range of monstrous figures in the cultural mainstream. Not just rehabilitated monsters or recentered monsters from a broader range of folklores, and not just new threats representing the horrors of injustice, but brand new monsters who make us question our received ideas about the borders of the possible and of the acceptable. Monsters that make us ask, is it so grotesque to have a body that is shaped or functions differently from the majority of bodies, or is larger or smaller than average? Is it truly unnatural to transgress cramped categories of gender, or to strive for a larger or simply a different range of expression than the ones imposed on us by an accident of DNA? Or does the real monstrosity lie in cultish devotion to the poverty of the binary? Have we accepted arbitrary limitations on what people like us, whatever that means for you, can aspire to or achieve or expect? Have we cultivated distaste for people who ask for more? Are we taking on faith that certain emotions, reactions, or coping mechanisms are human and others are somehow bestial? Do we frame particular bodily abilities and presentations as deformations or impairments? And is it actually a little messed up to consign some subsets of natural variation to automatic monstrosity? These are, of course, questions that we can ask ourselves in isolation in the abstract, without a monster figure to focus them. And I think they're questions that we have been asking ourselves both as individuals and as a culture. But what I want to ask is, when we do focus them through the monster, what stories do those monsters tell? Just as the monstrous cautionary tale served to enforce boundaries, the monstrous hero can help us destroy them, plastering a bright bullseye on the walls it previously patrolled. I want to thank you all for being our guides, our interpreters, and our trailblazers in the age of the monster, and I'm excited to find out what else may be lurking here. Thank you. I'm happy to take some questions, but please be merciful. I have been out of academia for almost 20 years. So I may not, I asked questions I didn't understand, so it's fine if you guys ask questions that I don't understand, but.
We've got some Brandon?
And I can't. This is another book of audiobooking. The question I have has to do about the idea of the idea of the sirens alone on their island,
Yeah.
and what they're talking about amongst themselves. I don't know if you've read Eden Royce, but one of her, so she's a writer of the Gullah Geechee Nation, and one of the things she looks at is the boo hag figure, and how, let me not ramble. The thing that's interesting about that is I feel like sometimes monsters only exist and get taken up in relation to others. So for instance, the boo hag, which had a central meaning to the Black Southern community, all of a sudden becomes a figure which stands in for the encounter with whiteness. And so I'm thinking of the sirens on their island and just, I don't know, what it's like to imagine what is monstrous to the monster without having to relate to that dominant outside group. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes so much sense. And I'm going to come and find you after to get that author's name when I have my phone. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is the big question, right? Is like, monsters are given meaning, when monsters are given meaning externally, then they tend to represent a certain set of metaphors, right? Which are initially, which are metaphors about like what not to do. Don't go here, don't aspire to this. And I think there's a few different ways, and this is what I think is so exciting right now, there's a few different ways of sort of upending that. I don't think that the only way is to ask sort of what do monsters talk about with each other. But I think what is interesting about asking that question specifically is the way that it kind of troubles all of our ideas about what even counts as a monster, like what's an outsider versus what's an insider. And so when you say, what are these monsters going to say to each other? How do they view each other? You're automatically taking away one aspect of monstrosity from them because they're no longer an outsider group. To each other, they're probably not monstrous. And so I think, like, I guess it's sort of simultaneously like demonstering them and monstering, the outside. And yeah, I think that's the best I can do at that question. But
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was really wonderful, and similarly, I'm looking forward to reading your book very much. I think maybe a 4 decades old article at this point, Jonathan Z. Smith talks about the demonic as a locative category that can move, but monsters as being more geographically fixed, particularly in Greek context. And while I'm sure, having said that now, we can all think of an exception, it is generally, like, if you don't go to Scylla and Charybdis, they're not going to come to you. And when you were working with these monsters and how they're reinterpreted, did you find that fixed geographic nature something that was immediately shed or something that worked its way through some of their reinterpretations?
That's a really interesting question because it wasn't something that I had thought about, but it is something that feels, for some of these monsters, sort of intuitively important. And so, I mean, this is a book of essays, right? I'm not at this point a scholar. And so, I did a lot of research, but a lot of what I'm doing is sort of trying to work with these monsters metaphorically and sort of saying, like, what metaphorical value can we sort of dredge from them, that is useful to us in some way. And so there were a few monsters, including, I think Chimera is probably the one that is the most sort of located in space, because it's probably like maybe the sort of I can't remember the word for the real world origins of monsters, but it may be based on like a particular area in Turkey, one mountain that has these flame spurts, and then also snakes are there, and so that one I actually was using the monster as a sort of metaphor for that space, and then also for a certain type of like building that I really like, where the building like gets weirder the further you go in. I don't mean like House of Leaves, I mean like the House on the Rock. And so basically my answer is I didn't know about this from a scholarly perspective, but there are some of these monsters that like, they almost instinctively, you're like, oh, well, the sirens are on their island. And the chimera is like rooted somehow in this mountain. But it wasn't something I was doing consciously.
Katerina.
First of all, thank you so much for your wonderful talk and your wonderful book. And maybe I can connect a question actually to the point that was just discussed about giving something a space or a place. Because when reading your book, I had the impression that you gave, via language, a place to feelings that I think many women or people identifying as women have and know, and they're pre-language. And I have the feeling what you're doing in your text is actually a writing out of something that is already there, and I would be very much interested about your take on language and the monster, which is actually, as soon as we start to describe it, it's actually not a monster anymore, or as soon as it has a name, it's technically then it is a chimera, and it has a name, it's, yeah. I would be very interested about that.
Well, first of all, that is a beautiful compliment. I think that's probably what any personal essayist is trying to do. It's definitely what I'm trying to do. I don't think that there is, and this is something that like I probably disagree with people who are more skilled essayists than me. But like for me, I don't feel like there's a point in describing something that only feels relevant to me, or just like something that happened to me where I'm telling a story. Like the entire point is to find a way to describe something that happened to you, that you maybe didn't notice or that you don't have a way of sort of framing. For me, I think it has always been sort of natural and useful to use a metaphor, often to the point of ridiculousness. And in a sense, this is the point of ridiculousness. Like this is like a whole series of extended metaphors. But I think that that's something that metaphor can do for you, is that it gives you essentially a way to tell yourself your own story through the medium of a different story. And it does sort of like make that visible and expressible. And so yeah, so that was something that I was trying consciously to do. And I think that like, it's not just, I don't think it's just me, I think it's also the stories that I'm using, that because these are metaphorically robust stories, obviously I'm trying to like massage the metaphors so that they work as well as possible, but also like, that's what these stories have been doing this whole time. Like they are there to be metaphors about human experience. So I'm kind of like hitchhiking on that and kind of turning it on its head. So yeah, up with metaphors. That's it.
Hi. Is this on? Okay. Hi, thank you very much for your talk. It was amazing. I apologize, I'm starting with an anecdote, but I haven't seen Barbie. And I had an opportunity before the semester started to see that film or Oppenheimer, Christopher Nolan's film. I'll see both, don't worry. But it's, I felt pressure to see that movie because I teach film noir, and I've done it for 10 years, and I've had male colleagues say, how do you teach in a male genre like that? But all that leading up to the figure of the femme fatale is one that I study a lot. And I've wondered if you've come across parallels between the femme fatale and like Medusa, as you've done your research, the deadly female.
That's a great question. You know, I haven't, mostly just because I didn't do a ton of work in like contemporary, like literary theory or cultural theory research-wise, because it is in many ways like, you know, an essay collection is a weird animal, a weird hybrid chimera, honestly. And so there was a certain degree to which like I had to kind of put a boundary on how much research I was doing versus sort of analysis and synthesis on my own. And so what I ended up doing the research on mostly is the more ancient stuff, and also some kind of like weird things that I brought in, like the Schmidt sting pain index, which is an index of how bad different bugs feel when they sting you. But so this is all to say I hadn't encountered that. That feels instinctively like a really robust comparison. So if you write it, you should send it to me.
Nice.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk, and I really look forward to reading this. I study mermaids and sirens, so. I was really interested in what you were saying, because I've always loved like retellings. And I was really interested in what you were saying about this genre of retellings and like the white cis womenist of it all. And I don't know, I don't have a specific question, but I just wanted to hear more, because I feel like I really love retellings, but I feel like so many of these retellings take the monster and make her good, like they always redeem her, right? And so it's not as fun as a villain origin story, because like the fun is taken out of it, and often the willfulness is taken out of it because she's given some other motivation for her monstrosity that's about protecting others or whatever. So she's kind of redeemed within this kind of discourse of respectable womanhood. And the problem is not that she was a monster, but that she was misunderstood. And I feel like there's something about white feminism that's doing that, but that's my own thought. I'm gonna sit with that some more. But I just wanted to hear more about, because I know you were saying that there can be more, right? The monster can be I thought that was a beautiful line, like the creature at the gate is the signpost to get out. Yeah. So I just wanted to kind of hear more of your thoughts about that there's something beyond redemption that could be done with the revisiting of these stories.
Yeah, so a few people have expressed some version of that today and yesterday, and I think it's like such a good point, and I wish that I had I wish that I had thought about it more while I was writing this, because I think there's a ton to be said about like the project of recentering versus the project of rehabilitation, and how those are not the same thing. I actually, like Michael said, I was previously the editor-in-chief of Electric Lit, and we did an essay about Cruella that was just like, please let women be villains, like exactly what you're saying. Like, can we just like not keep moving these people into conventional morality? Like, why is that what the backstory is for? I think you're absolutely right. I think you are onto something, because I have heard a few people say this. I will say that like that Venn diagram was published books. There are more coming that I think are going to be less white and less cis, and it is still going. Like I'm still seeing so many. This is like the kind of behind the scenes look that I get from working in publishing. Like I see a lot of book announcements that are retelling. So what I'm hoping is that, yeah, they get more nuanced, right? And like are just taking on a more challenging and more interesting topic of like making you care very deeply about the monster or about someone who has been sort of abjected historically, but not sort of requiring that to mean being admirable or even being like relatable or likable or understandable. That's harder. Like it takes more skill, and so I think it wasn't like the first wave, and it probably won't ever be the like really like the sell 1 million copies Cersei thing. But I think there's definitely a space for it, and I think more books like that coming.
Thank you so much for your amazing work. And I had a response to that and a bit of a question. I'm sort of thinking through it in real time, but this impulse towards the restructuring of the monster as somehow justified, that if they aren't the good guy, they're at the very least the anti-hero. That and oh, do I have feelings about how rape centers into this? The idea that women's monstrosity must be the result of male violence. But what I'm thinking about here, I think, is, like I said, real-time thoughts. To redeem the monster is a way to reclaim humanity from the complete otherness of the monster, whereas to allow villainy, I think, is the next step in the full humanity of those that are being pulled back from the abjected land of the monster, and that I think there is this impulse to rehabilitate first, because when humanity is so utterly denied as to place a person or population in the monster, that the capacity to be human, I think you can go straight from there to human villainy, but it would take a tremendously skilled writer. But I think what we're all twigging on is that humanity can't be completely recaptured until women or other populations have the culturally recognized capacity to be completely terrible and selfish and awful on an individual level, as opposed to it being characteristic of the population as a form of abjection. So I don't know if that worked, but I just wanted to flag that as a possible part of the process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, and I think, I mean, at risk of sounding sort of incrementalist, I think it makes sense that it happens in that order. That you kind of like reclaim first the ability to be human and then the ability to be inhuman again on your own terms. And I will say this is a different, to me, this is a different kind of monster from the kind that I'm interested in, but I did see an interesting mini trend of new books that center on female serial killers who are unrepentant and like really kind of twists on the Patrick Bateman character. One of them is Maeve Fly, which I think is poised to be like a big sort of horror hit. It is too disgusting for me, but if you like that kind of thing, you should definitely read it. And the other is Kill for Love by Laura Picklesheimer, which is more of a sort of satire in the American Psycho vein. But that makes me think that like maybe this is the leading edge of like reclaiming the ability to, after having reclaimed the ability to be human, reclaiming the ability to be inhuman.
I haven't had a chance to read your book, but it sounds wonderful. And I'm wondering if what you've been saying about metaphor and thinking about that as I'm looking at these pictures on the screen, I'm wondering if you can talk more specifically about the physical characteristics and their metaphorical potential of the monsters you're dealing with, the Medusas, snakes, and how do those work into the metaphor, and how do those work into restructuring all of this?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting is that like the monsters that have, kind of an enduring fandom are the ones that look more human. And in a way, the ones that I found the most interesting or the most like kind of metaphorically rich were the ones that don't look human at all, and yet are still like female. They're still presented as feminine figures. Like, why is Charybdis female? That is a whirlpool. That is a geographical, whatever, a weather system, but still gendered. And so that's very interesting to me. The chimera, which has a mane, like a male lion, is still a she. And I think those fall by the wayside a little bit because of their specific embodiment. It's not pretty. It's not, it hasn't been sort of like reclaimed as a form, as like the obverse of beauty in any way. Like these are just truly bestial, or like not even bestial, right? Like not even a being. And in some ways, I think that those were sort of the more interesting ones to dig into, because it's harder to find the humanity in things that aren't humans or aren't even animals. The Hydra is another one. Like, that's a snake with a lot of heads. That one genuinely was challenging for me. So I think that in that sense, like the way that they manifest physically is becomes part of like what you then have to do with the metaphor and like how much work there is to do with it.
Hi, just want to echo again, thank you so much for your sharing of this information. My question centers on the concept of the genesis of monsters, specifically in the Greek myth. As so many monsters, I feel like at least the ones that come to my mind are kind of interferences by the gods, or even the concept of something like Echidna, which is one of my favorite kind of monsters, is mother of monsters, who just pumps out monster after monster. So I'm curious about this question of Genesis in the Greek tradition, but also thinking about how monsters are made now, or even in this process of remediation, how they're kind of recreated. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
So this is literally like the last like the epilogue of the book is about Echidna. It is true that like many of the Greek monsters are punishments, and most of the other ones are brothers and sisters. They all have the same mother who like basically gave birth to them under a mountain. And it has now been like long enough since I wrote the book that I'm like, can I remember what I said? But I was basically asking this question, like, how are monsters born, and like what does that mean for us? And what I thought was interesting about it was, if monstrosity is something that comes from the sort of overlap between what you have and what is expected, it's essentially like, like the part of the sourdough starter that like bubbles over. To me, that feels like a nice kind of inversion of the sort of very cis-centric idea of like birth and generation being the province of women. If monstrosity is like born out of this overflow, then you can kind of say birth and generation is the province of women. It detaches it from the womb and all of that sort of problematic 1970s ideas of femininity. So that was kind of like my, again, like we're in the realm of metaphor here, but my sort of thesis was the birth of a monster is the overlap, the difference between what you have and what you are supposed to have, or what you are and what you're supposed to be. And in that sense, it becomes kind of, that kind of generation becomes accessible to anybody who is constrained. So I don't know if that answers your question, but Echidna is in there. Yeah. That might be everybody. I can't.
We probably have time for one more question, if there's one more question that anyone would like to ask. Okay. Oh. Gotcha. Okay.
Kind of an unfair one, but as you have gone beyond the writing of this book, is there anything you wish that you had added that is not there?
I mean, definitely, like truly as of this weekend, I feel like there's a lot more thinking to be done about focusing on the monster and understanding the monster without needing to rehabilitate or excuse or like bring it into line with sort of conventional morality. I didn't engage with that a lot, and I don't know that I would have done a good job of it, but like I wish that not even I wish that I'd done it, but like now I want to go home and think about that more. So that's the thing that's springing to mind. Obviously, like in a lot of ways, it is, if you're writing about feminism and you don't feel 2 years on like you left out some shit, then you're not listening to enough people. So like in that sense, absolutely, like it feels, some of these essays were from like 2017, you know, and then I spruced them up, but like of course there's going to be ideas that I could have sharpened, or that, you know, more sort of voices that I could have brought in. And I think that, you know, in some ways that's just kind of like, that's a book, right? Like it's a sort of frozen idea. And if your frozen idea from 2021 looks exactly like all of your current ideas, then like you should probably read more. So.
What a fantastic place to end. Let's thank Jess for that absolutely extraordinary talk.
Thank you, guys.